it's so important that we're all here sharing our diverse experiences and disciplinary expertises and so forth. Helen, you're a hard act to follow. So forgive me now for not being as dynamic and, I mean, she's Helen. No one is Helen. I was asked to put this process in a bit more of perspective and talk about criminal prosecutions of human rights abuses in Latin America in a broader sense. And I've been doing some research on this for quite a while now. My work actually focuses primarily on Peru, and I've been following the justice process in Peru very closely for the last umpteen years now. And I got involved in the Guatemala experience through a project that Emmy and I started about a year and some months ago on Right to Truth that involved Peru, Guatemala, and a couple of other countries. And as the Rios Montt trial came into focus, we started working in developing the project to do the blog monitoring, the trial monitoring rather. So let me just start with a brief introduction, and then I have a couple of ideas I'd like to share with you, and then we can move on to a broader Q&A with the rest of you. So first I want to start by making reference to a study that was published back in 2009 that documented around 60 prosecutions around the world of former heads of state, of actual or former heads of state. Most of those were for corruption, but a number of them, and an increasing number of them, I think, involve grave violations of human rights. In most cases, these criminal trials for violations of human rights, including genocide, crimes against humanity, forced disappearances, extrajudicial executions, sexual violence, and torture, are conducted in international tribunals, like the International Tribunal for former Yugoslavia, or the ICC, or by hybrid bodies consisting of international and local judges, such as the extraordinary chambers in the courts of Cambodia. But, and I think we all have a sense of this, in Latin America in recent years there has been a growing trend, an important trend, an incredibly understudied trend to criminally prosecute human rights violations in domestic courts. This is especially important, I think, because of how entrenched impunity has been in Latin America. We've heard a lot about how impunity operates in Guatemala, and it's not that much different in a lot of the region. We'll talk about that. So let me jump ahead and talk a little bit about some of the key transitional justice developments in Latin America to date. And I'm going to make a few points, but I'm just outlining the points, and then I'll go into some detail about each one. So first of all, I think it's important to note that despite the talk of a justice cascade and criminal prosecutions in Latin America, there is a great degree of variation in how effective and how advanced accountability efforts are in Latin America. So while there is a justice cascade in Latin America, there are these new normative understandings about states having the obligation to investigate, prosecute, and punish grave violations of human rights. What happens domestically, how those norms are implemented, whether they're implemented varies a great deal. I'll talk about that in a bit more detail with reference to the region. Then I'd like to outline what I think are some of the key factors that have contributed to criminal prosecutions in Latin America. And this builds very nicely on some of the things that have been said in the panel. I think I have a few extra points I'd like to add. And finally, I'm going to argue that these accountability efforts, and again, this seems obvious today, 24 hours after yesterday's ruling, but I don't think it's obvious. And it is that these accountability efforts are not inevitable or foregone conclusions. They are highly vulnerable. And I think this has very much to do with the fact that the democratic transitions that we've seen in Latin America over the last 20 or so years have in fact been only partial transitions, in which citizenship remains precarious and authoritarian powers remain emboldened and often embedded, the other way around, embedded and often emboldened in existing state institutions. Let me just highlight transitional justice efforts in Latin America briefly. On the one, I'm going to be very schematic here, obviously. On the one hand, I think we have Argentina and Chile, where I think we can talk about the consolidation of transitional justice efforts, where we've seen criminal prosecutions moving forward in recent years very significantly. At the other end, we have countries like El Salvador or Brazil, where in fact there have been 0 prosecutions for human rights abuses. And in between there are countries like Peru, Uruguay, and I would place Guatemala here, where we've seen important strides, but also serious setbacks. And I'm going to talk about that here. So first let me talk about, very, very briefly, the countries that where there's been no capacity to conduct trials in cases of human rights abuses. El Salvador and Brazil. These are both cases where blanket amnesty laws were put in place and that has stood the test of time, have not been, either when they've been challenged, they've been upheld, or they've never been challenged. And so in these cases, no prosecutions have moved forward to date. Maybe there will be movement in the future. I know there are things afoot, especially in El Salvador. I see you nodding. We'll see. Argentina and Chile, we've seen, I think we can talk about a consolidation of these transitional justice processes. Of course, in both cases after a long and rocky road. And let me just talk about Argentina briefly. So in Argentina, we had, right after the transition, we had that big trial against the former junta members, that 1985 trial, which 5 of the 9 junta members were found guilty and sentenced to life in prison. And you had the beginning of what seemed like a solid transitional justice process, only to be met with serious military resistance and then a series of amnesty laws and pardons that returned Argentina to a state of almost pure impunity throughout the 1990s. And it wasn't until 2005, almost 20 years later, that the Supreme Court declared the amnesty laws to be unconstitutional and a new wave of prosecutions began. The key to the consolidation of accountability efforts in Argentina, I mean, aside from the fact that you have a dynamic civil society movement, a dynamic group of victims, survivors, and human rights nonprofit organizations, is the fact that you had a government, the Nestor Kirchner government, that established prosecutions as state policy. The executive, the legislature, and the judiciary established we are going to prosecute criminally perpetrators of grave human rights abuses. And so to date, over 2,000, mostly military, but also some civilians, have been prosecuted, or are in the process of being prosecuted, and we have over 386 convictions in Argentina. Nowhere else do you see anything like this. It's a consolidation, I think, of the transitional justice process. Then there's the countries that fall somewhere in the middle. Uruguay, Peru, and I'm not going to talk about Guatemala because we've heard, I think, a lot about that already, but I want to give you some broader context. So Uruguay is a country where, after the transition, when individuals began bringing cases to court involving members of the armed forces, the Minister of Defense himself, a military man and deeply involved in the dictatorship, said, I will not send any of my men to a courtroom. And as a result, the Uruguayan parliament passed an amnesty law. It was passed in democracy, it was not a self-amnesty law. And for 20 plus years, there was total impunity. In Uruguay, not a single person was ever held to account for the abuses that occurred during the military dictatorship. That began to change largely due to creative lawyering, where lawyers connected to the human rights movement and to victims started looking for ways around the existing amnesty law, right? So they said, well, you know, the amnesty law talks about military, but it doesn't talk about civilians. The first president under the dictatorship was a civilian. Let's prosecute him, and they did. In 2006, Bordaberry was arrested. In 2009 or 10, he was convicted. There was an effort to overturn the amnesty law twice by popular vote. Both times failed. But in the aftermath of the Inter-American Court ruling, the Parliament passed a law nullifying the 1986 amnesty. That was in November 2011. So you begin to see a process where it seems like in Uruguay there's a shift, right? Things are beginning to change. The amnesty law is essentially overturned, and criminal investigations can get moving. And indeed, cases begin to move forward. Dozens and hundreds of cases actually begin to be presented to the courts. Only a year and a few months later to have the Supreme Court first remove the judge who's overseeing the bulk of the human rights investigations, and then decree in a ruling that the law that overturned the amnesty law was unconstitutional, basically halting human rights investigations in Uruguay. So you had this, fitting and starting, moving forward and then moving back, moving forward and then moving back, and now we're at a standstill virtually in Uruguay. Yesterday was the March of Silence every year on March 20th. May 20th, and there was the big sign that everyone marched behind was, in mi país no hay justicia, ¿quién es el responsable? In my country there is no justice, who is responsible for this? Peru, you have a similar situation. There have been some dramatic victories in Peru in terms of transitional justice, but also some serious setbacks. And just very briefly, since I only have a few minutes left. The most important, obviously, verdict being the Fujimori verdict in 2009, but there have been a number of other important investigations and sentences in Peru from 2006 until around 2010. And then you begin to see a shift in 2009, 2010, and what you're seeing now is hundreds of cases being closed due to lack of evidence or information about the perpetrators, hundreds of cases just stalled, stuck in preliminary investigations. And in the cases that are in the judiciary phase, acquittal after acquittal. So today in Peru, you have twice as many military officers acquitted as convicted. So it's 66 convicted and over 130 have been acquitted. Is that right? 66 convicted, 130 something acquitted. So I had this whole thing about what makes this possible. Very, very quickly. One is the persistent and steady struggle of victims and their allies in the human rights movement, both domestically and internationally. The kind of creative lawyering that I was talking about a moment ago, finding ways to bypass or get around existing amnesty laws, making creative arguments, like the idea that disappearance is a permanent and ongoing term. That was invented in Latin America. It's since become part of, I think, I'm not a lawyer, I think it's part of international law now.
Yes.
Thank you. Or using international law to help overturn standing amnesty laws, which is what's happened in Peru with the Barrios Altos ruling by the Inter-American Court. The second factor has to do with something that Marcy laid out very clearly in the case of Guatemala, and that is changes within the judiciary itself. And I think it varies from place to place how extensive and how deep these changes go, and that may have something to do with how sustainable or not these processes are. And connected to that, I think, is the role of key judicial actors. And I could name Claudia Paz y Paz for Guatemala, for Chile, Juan Guzman, for Peru, Avelino Guillén and Cesar San Martin, and Uruguay, Mirta Guillense, Mariano. There are key people in the public ministry and the judiciary who have, often in the face of the contempt of their peers, and at great risk to themselves, have taken on these cases and moving forward. And I think third, and this was touched upon by Helen in the case of Guatemala, and that is the political context. What particular configurations allow trials to move forward or not? So just a couple of ideas here. In Argentina, after the collapse of dictatorial governments, new democratic regimes, regardless of their ideological affiliation, sought to prosecute the crimes of previous regimes, partly in an attempt to restore democratic credibility and citizen faith in the rule of law and in government itself. But both of those processes saw steps backward, right, in different ways and different moments. In other places, political configurations are so tight, the alliances between military, civilian, political, and economic elites are so tight that it's been very difficult to break down those structures of impunity and push these processes forward. And I think we see that clearly in El Salvador, we see it clearly in Brazil, and until recently we saw it in Guatemala, until very recently. And I think another factor which is often overlooked is what Machiavelli once called fortuna, which is just these things that happen almost surreptitiously. Fujimori, for example, deciding to leave his safe haven in Japan for Chile, very bad move on his part, and he was extradited. He did not expect that to happen, obviously, but he was extradited. Rios Montt stepping down from Congress and his immunity being lifted. He could have continued maybe for another period, maybe not, but he was there for 5 terms, he could have. Anyway, but it doesn't always work. It's not an automatic thing. Alan Garcia had immunity when he was president for the second time between 2006 and 2011, and he stepped down, and until now, no one has brought a case against him, although I would argue that one certainly could. Speaking not as a lawyer, so I guess I'm going to skip all this other stuff, but I just want to end by referring to what I think is the elephant in the room that Helen has brought to the fore, which is that in many of our countries in Latin America, judicial reform has gone only so far to actually create democratic judiciaries. I think when we talk about reform of the armed forces, headway is even less notable.